Hello, my name is Russell Morris, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Off the Shelf, a book discussion series brought to you by the Conference Board. Today, I'm speaking with Thomas Wedell-Wedellsborg to discuss his latest book, What's Your Problem? So today on Off the Shelf, we're talking with Thomas Wedell-Wedellsborg, a researcher, advisor, author, and speaker who's worked with dozens of big brand name companies across the world. Particularly focused today on his recent book on problem solving called What's Your Problem? To solve your toughest problems, change the problems you solve. Thomas brings a really interesting background and a lot of experience to this book, and it shows on every page. It's lively, it's well written, great anecdotes, and I just really excited about having a conversation with you today, Thomas, and welcome you to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Russell. It's a pleasure to join you and the Conference Board listeners.
So, Thomas, as I was reading the book, I got really curious because it's straightforward, it's clean, you have great stories and examples that made it come alive very quickly for me, and I got really curious. I'm like, okay, where's this coming from? Why are we talking about this? And I did something that was a little bit unusual for me. I flipped to the acknowledgments right away, and I expected a short paragraph about how you had a brilliant moment on an airplane someplace, or you had some interaction with a customer that sparked your enthusiasm about this. But instead of an acknowledgement page, it was like an acknowledgement section. It was probably the most generous piece from an author that I recall seeing, and it suggests to me that this is more than an individual passion. This is something that you've been working on for a long time.
That's true, and thank you, Russell, for noticing that. I'm not always sure how many people read the acknowledgements section. It's funny because within innovation in the early history of the research there used to be this thing called the great man theory of innovation. That was literally what it was called. And that was the notion that ideas come from brilliant individuals. Now, I love to flatter myself with that moniker, but that's not true. Ideas we know now, they come from collaboration, and that's very much true for my work on reframing as well. It builds on 50 years of existing research from lots of different fields. And it builds, especially perhaps on the last 10 years that I've worked on this with clients, with people in the real world, trying to solve their problems and hone the method as I go along. So to me, it would feel weird not to credit those many people that have been part of this process.
So so you talked about reframing, and that's the meat of the book. But talk to our listeners today about how you're thinking about it, and what that means for our conversation today.
It really starts with the recognition that we just tend to waste a lot of time, money, resources on solving the wrong problems. When I went out and asked 106 C-suite executives about the extent to which they felt that people in the organization often, barked up the wrong trees, 85% came back and said that's an issue for us, and we tend to lose a good deal of time and money on. And so reframing, in a sense, is the answer to that. Reframing is the ability to, when you face a problem, instead of jumping straight into solution mode, as most people do, it's about taking a step back and asking, is this necessarily the right problem for us to solve? That's really reframing in a nutshell.
So I want you to share with our listeners the examples that you share in the book, because it's so simple and poignant, and it really makes the point that much clearer. So can you talk about the elevator?
It's basically the idea that you imagine for a second you are the owner of an office building, and that your tenants in the building, they are complaining about the speed of the elevator. What most people do in a situation like that, when they have to solve that problem, is to jump into action. So they take for granted the problem statement, the elevator is slow, and then they try to come up with ideas for making the elevator faster. Can we upgrade the motor, tweak the algorithm? Do we need to go out and buy a new elevator? Now, if you ask building managers in the real world what they do when they receive complaints about a slow elevator, they try something else first, which is to put up a mirror in the hallway. Because what happens, of course, is when people see a mirror, they completely forget time and they gaze lovingly at their own countenance. The point here is that good solutions, they often come not from trying to brainstorm on a specific solution space, if you will, but about taking a step back, saying, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And is there a different way of looking at that problem? Is there another problem, a better problem out there for us to solve, like with the elevator and the mirror? That's really the central idea.
So thank you for that. And as our listeners are contemplating this and we're talking about it, this isn't a new idea, right? I mean, we've been talking about reframing and in various disciplines for as long as anybody can remember, and then some. Why the book now? You know, why bring this back? Why look at it in a different way?
It came as a gradual surprise to me that people aren't better at it, because, as you say, it's an old idea. We have even Albert Einstein back in 1938. He talks about this notion of like the importance of regarding old problems from a new angle. And yet, when I work with my clients, it became increasingly clear that people weren't good at it. And the aha moment for me was probably some years ago. I ran or was part of a big 1 week long program for a Fortune 500 company. They had gathered 300 of their top leaders in the entire business. You had to be among the top 2% of your peer group to be in the room. And I taught them reframing. We taught them a lot of other things. And at the end of the week, when we surveyed them and asked what was the most useful thing you learned during this week, the answer came back, number one, reframing. And that worried me, because when you think about it, why on earth didn't these people know it already? How come that some really, really smart people working in a Fortune 500 company, they haven't learned how to reframe problems, how to make sure they're solving the right problems already? How much are we wasting right now in our organizations because otherwise smart people don't master this basic idea of sanity checking whether they're solving the right problem? That was really the impetus. That was the day I decided, I think I have to write something about this to get it out more widely.
So as you were thinking about this, did you figure out why people aren't better at it?
I think there's a few layers to that. One is that this is not about the intellectual understanding of it. It's also about the how of reframing. You actually have to get some idea about how to do this in practice. Second, I think it's important that this becomes an easy process, a habit of mind, because we can do this when we're good. When we have the big annual strategy seminar, then there's some semblance of detailed thinking about the problem. But the place in my mind in which we need this most, and that's where we're missing a tool, I feel, is in our everyday meetings, in our Monday meetings, in our Wednesday afternoons, whenever it is. And I think ultimately, why is that the case? I think it's because, in part, the existing work on reframing and problem diagnosis to a large degree comes from engineering and operations. And it's been very powerful there. But there's also, I think, been a tendency to create these very comprehensive frameworks, specialist disciplines, Six Sigma, what have you, where, in a sense, reframing has gotten trapped. I see reframing as something that's crucial to get out and democratize it, so everybody in the workplace can do it. It's not okay that it's just trapped in a specialist discipline or an education you have to go out and get that's hard to get or expensive or whatever it is. I think it's somewhere between those things, that the how of the reframing, the speed of it, and making it less complex so it fits into our everyday lives. I think that's what's been holding us back to a large extent.
So we're going to take a short break for some quick announcements, and we'll be back in just a minute to continue this fascinating conversation with Thomas Wedell-Wedellsborg and his book, What's Your Problem? To Solve Your Toughest Problems, Change the Problems You Solve.
Can you, your team, or your company benefit from insights such as the ones provided in this podcast? They are immediately available when you join the Conference Board, a membership-based think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. Reaching across industries and geographies, we bring together our noted experts, senior executives from the world's largest companies, and nonpartisan practical research to help you address your most important business issues. Our membership packages are tailored to your organization's unique needs and budget. To learn more about our offerings, go to www.conferenceboard.org and click Join on the top bar to connect with one of our product specialists.
Hello, and welcome back to our conversation with Thomas Wedell-Wedellsborg, the author of What's Your Problem? To Solve Your Toughest Problems, Change the Problems You Solve. Now, before the break, we were talking about why people aren't getting better at reframing. And it occurred to me, Thomas, that there's I think, often misattributed quote to Einstein about if you have an hour, spend most of it defining the problem or something. I recall in the book that you said you don't like that quote. Can you talk to me about that?
That's right. I think that quote about, spending 55 minutes defining the problem and the last 5 minutes solving it is one of the most dangerous quotes in this space of problem solving. And you're right, it is misattributed. People think Einstein said it. He never did. The problem with the quote is that, well, on the surface, it sounds sensible. It sounds, it says you have to pay attention to the problem. And that's a good message. The danger comes when you actually pay attention to the how, because what it's really saying is you should spend 90% plus of your time up front on analysis. That's a bad idea. That leads to paralysis by analysis. And that's everything that I feel that the lean startup movement has taught us not to do. So the better way to work with reframing is to see it as an iterative practice. You might go out on a Monday morning, you have a problem, and you spend even 15 minutes going in and trying to reframe that problem. Then you swing into action mode the rest of the week, and then Friday you resurface again and you say, let's take a quick break and check in. Given what we've done during this week, does anybody have a new perspective on the problem? Are we still focused on the right framing here? That's the key to getting it right. Instead of thinking that you need to go off to a mountaintop for a week and think deeply about your problem before you can start moving. That's just never going to happen given how busy most people are.
So there's already some diagnostic methods out there, things like root cause analysis or the famous 5 whys method. How is this approach? How is your approach with reframing different?
I think the best way to illustrate the difference is to go back to the slow elevator example we discussed before. Because as you'll notice, there's really 2 different ways of trying to look for a reframing on a problem. What most people do when they are faced with a problem is they delve into the detail and try to understand the particular system that they're kind of in. They ask the question, why is the elevator slow? They might ask that 5 times. The problem with that approach is you're still getting trapped in the first framing of the problem. One of the core differences with reframing is the ability to step back and say, instead of asking, why is the elevator slow? You need to ask first, is the speed of the elevator the right thing to focus on? Or is there a completely different framing of this problem that has nothing to do with the speed? That's, I think, that's where some of these other methods, 5 whys, root cause analysis, sometimes can lead people astray. Root cause analysis as well. You can almost hear it in the term. It suggests that there's one single cause of a problem. And that's not the case. But the most problems we face in our lives, they are multi-causal. And that's in a sense good news, because that means that there are typically multiple different ways of trying to solve that. You won't always surface through root cause analysis or 5 whys or similar. That's where you need Reframe.
So in today's world, with so many problems around us, how can we use reframing in this environment? When we're trying to deal with the COVID virus, we're trying to deal with climate change, we're trying to deal with economic challenges. Is there a role for this in this environment?
I think the role is more pertinent than ever, because if everybody who's been affected by COVID, they are suddenly facing this host of new problems in their lives. I think reframing has an important role in dealing with COVID, in dealing with climate change, in dealing with all these global issues we're facing. But in some sense, we're already paying a good deal of attention to those problems just by virtue of having like thousands, if not millions, of people around the world really, really thinking carefully about this. Where I see the biggest value here is actually on smaller problems. But with that, I mean the problems that all of us face in our day-to-day lives. Figuring out how to work more efficiently with a team, figuring out how to navigate clients now that the situation has changed, figuring out how to deal with family dynamics is something that a lot of people are experiencing at the moment. And that's a good thing too, in the sense of reframing shouldn't be reserved for big problems only. That the key thing here, since this is a mental muscle you have to build, well, you do that through starting to practice it in small steps on some of the problems that you're facing here. The final thing I'd say on that front as well is, once you've started getting a handle on it, share it with some of the people you work with, because it's difficult to reframe things alone. You'll get a lot better at it, and you'll get better at seeing your own blind spots once the people you work with know what reframing is and can help you with that conversation.
So that makes a lot of sense to me on multiple levels, but particularly start small and work your way up, but also you don't want to try to work your muscle that isn't well developed on a super heavy lift. You need to build up some ability before you go there. So let me flip it just a little, because we were just talking about sort of how I personally might use this. How do corporations use this? I mean, if I wanted to bring this to my team here at the conference board, or recommend that one of our members leverage this, how have you seen this play out at the corporate level?
I'll share a couple of stories from the book about how companies or professionals have used this, and I'll kind of, in the book, I share specific strategies for getting better at reframing problems, and I'll kind of link those to the stories I share as well. So one story I experienced with a team that worked in Brazil, and they had been given the job by their CEO of coming up with ways of improving the market's perception of their stock price. The CEO felt that many professional analysts and so on were kind of undervaluing their company. Now, the group initially sat down. They were, many of them, very finance savvy, of course. They sat down and made this beautiful dissection of all the different factors that go into a stock price. And at the end of that beautiful analysis, they were feeling a little bit dejected, because there's nothing there that the CEO didn't know already, or that wasn't very difficult to change. That's where one of these pieces of advice that I give came in. The idea of looking outside the frame and asking, instead of again delving into details, asking what's missing, but what are we not paying attention to? And in the room was an HR executive who asked a very different question that had nothing to do with financials. She asked, wait, when somebody, like when a financial analyst calls our company for information, who talks to them? And they realized that most of the calls from external analysts were directed to more junior people inside the business that didn't know how to talk to financial analysts. So that was just a very clear example of somebody going in and trying to step back and say, is there a different perspective on the problem that we haven't explored here, instead of getting blinded by all the financial metrics. Another powerful example I saw was a management team that they perceived there was a lack of innovation in their business, and that was true. And so they wanted to roll out an innovation framework. They had found a specific framework that they really liked, and they were sitting and discussing how to roll it out. The manager who I worked with and followed for a number of years, he knew the importance of getting outsiders involved in a discussion like that. A little bit like the example before with the HR person sitting in. So he invited in his personal assistant, a woman called Charlotte, and her presence proved pivotal because she at some point interrupts the management team and says, folks, I've been here for 12 years. I've seen 3 prior management teams try to roll out an innovation framework. They all failed. I don't think you're looking at the right problem. That spurred them to rethink their diagnosis of what solution was needed. And they eventually understood that people already knew how to innovate. This wasn't a skill set problem. It was a motivation problem. Most of the employees in the company didn't feel that engaged because they didn't feel that the company or the management team cared that much about them personally. And so they weren't that likely to put in an extra effort at work beyond their job descriptions. Once the team realized that, they pivoted completely. They focused 100% on making people more engaged, giving them more freedom and autonomy. And as a result, 4 years later, not only did their finances and their innovation ability improve, they also ended up becoming the country's best place to work in an external survey. So wow. Just this beautiful story this is one of the very early stories in my research, actually, and one of the things that clued me in to the importance of challenging your understanding of the problem you're looking at and of the solution you may have fallen in love with. I'll share a final example as well that's more on a personal level. This comes from Robert Sternberg, who's a big name in creativity research, and it's a short one. It's basically an executive who worked in the auto industry, and he loved his job, but he hated his boss. So one day he had enough of working with this horrible boss, and he goes to a headhunter and asks, can you help me? And the headhunter says, sure. There's lots of interest in the market at the moment. I can very easily find you a similar job. That same evening, the executive goes home to his wife and he talks with his wife, who happens to be a little bit of an expert on Reframe. And that together, they arrive at a better solution or a better goal to pursue. So the next morning, the executive goes back to the headhunter. He gives him his boss's CV. And then he asks the headhunter, can you find a job for this guy? That's what the headhunter. It's beautiful. That's what the headhunter does. And the boss, having no clue about what's going on, accepts the job, and the executive ends up getting promoted into his boss's old job. That to me is a powerful story of how the idea is that sometimes you should rethink your goals or the way you approach it. So if you want to escape from your horrible boss, well, one way is to get a new job, but maybe there's a more creative way of thinking about that job.
Love that. Well, Thomas, we started our conversation today thinking, and I referenced your generosity in writing the book, and I want to begin to close our conversation with the other aspect of this, and that is you provide a lot of very tangible tools that people can use to help them with reframing, both in the book and on your website. Can you tell us a little bit more about what those tools might be?
Yeah, there's, I think the first and most basic tool is, of course, the book, What's Your Problem, from Harvard Business Press. And I suggest that you, it's on Amazon and so on, but I perhaps suggest that you support your local booksellers as well by asking them first if they can get you a copy. Beyond the book, I have a website, howtoreframe.com. And on that, you'll find both a number of free downloads, some resources, some checklists, and some theory primer behind this if you want to delve deep. And I also have a couple of offerings around if you're interested in sharing this more widely within your organization. We offer everything from speaking at virtual or physical events, or train the trainer options, and corporate licensing, etc. So there's a number of ways. Once you've taken a look at the book, if you believe this is important, there's a number of ways we can help you share it more widely.
Terrific. So I want to end on a personal question. And one of the things that we like to do on Off the Shelf is share book recommendations. So if you share a book with me, I'll share a book with you. How about that?
Oh, amazing! I think I'll share two. I'll share a for fun read and a practical read. And the practical read is a book called Decisive, and that's written by Chip and Dan Heath. And I think that's if you're getting one book to complement your knowledge around reframing, this would be it. They gather a lot of the research on decision making, what makes for good versus bad decisions, and they convey it in a very compelling way. So I see that almost as the ideal complement to my own. For fun, I recommend a beautiful book. I've been really a fan of this for a long time. I recommend it to a lot of people. It's called The Lords of Strategy. And it's a former editor at HBR who's written it. And he's gone in and basically written an intellectual history of business, and specifically of how strategy as a concept arose. It's a historical tale of how back in the 60s we didn't really have strategy, and how a couple of people start getting together, start thinking about a new concept. And now, when we're looking at it, I mean, everybody knows what strategy is. It's a riveting example of how a store or a concept can enter the mainstream and become a really important tool for people. And I mentioned this, of course, as well, because I think that reframing could be another example of that. I dream of a world in which some years hence, where everybody knows what reframing is, and you don't need to tell people about it because they learned it already at their entry-level job or maybe even in school. So I think those two books, Decisive and The Lords of Strategy, they're my recommendation. Thanks. So Russell, what's your recommendation?
So I was thinking about it, and I'm going to recommend a book that one of my colleagues reviewed here on Off the Shelf a while back, called The Storm Before the Calm by George Friedman. I think it's particularly relevant here because George is looking at the current dynamic in American politics and American economics through a different lens. And it's very insightful the way he is approaching it. I hadn't seen that before, and it's a very well argued book, very thoughtful book, and would encourage you to take the time to read it.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So Thomas, thanks again for joining us today. This has been a really great conversation, and you sharing with us the insights from your book, your storytelling and your humor. It's fabulous, and I hope people will take the time to read the book and check out the resources at howtoreframe.com. And I encourage all of our listeners to subscribe to the Off the Shelf series by picking your favorite podcast platform. And we regularly have conversations with authors like Thomas, who are terrific and engaging and can help you in your work. So thank you again for joining us, and look forward to talking to you next time.